welcome to Novelty Show, the podcast where we spill the truth about the ups and downs of writing and the ins and outs of the publishing industry. I'm Lainey.
I'm Kat.
I'm Alexa. And this is episode 5, Crafting Characters.
We'd like to start this episode by thanking our patrons for voting on this topic, and stay tuned until the end of the show where we'll answer our Patreon question of the week.
So today we are talking about characters, and I think we should start out with the first question. What do you guys start with, the character or the plot and idea?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because so often the ideas come in like a very small form and kind of together. It's like a hint of a character and a hint of a story, and those together are like what sparks an idea for me. I definitely need the character before I start writing. I can start with just a character, but I couldn't start with just a story or a world. Like, the character is a very vital piece.
Agree completely. I start with concept, and I feel like you're similar. Lainey, I think you're probably similar as well. There's a concept that comes to mind, but then it's the essential question of who is the main character who will carry this story, and what's the best way to serve the story through character.
Yeah, I think most of my ideas come from a trope, so I immediately think of what would that character be like with that trope, and what kind of setting do I need to kind of craft for this kind of trope in my mind.
Which I think brings up a really good point, that it can be so difficult to discuss creating characters without simultaneously discussing world building and vice versa. Because so often the characters that we come up with are reflections of their world, but also they impact the world that you're writing.
Right. Character, world, and story are our big three intersections. It's like the triangle of like the important parts of a story, and you need all three of them. They all are so intertwined and play together so much that it's hard to just take one side of the triangle and like talk about that.
Yeah, and we're going to cover kind of developing characters in depth here, but we're also going to do a whole episode on the world building part, and there might be similar discussions in both episodes, but when you put the two of them together, we're hoping that we provide a really kind of clear picture of how to create those essential ingredients of a book. So what I'm wondering is, how much character work do you guys do before you start? Meaning, how much of your character development happens in pre-writing versus during the drafting process?
I spend about an equal amount of time with both character, setting, and plot in my pre-writing stage before I actually start writing. One of the things about character, though, that I always keep in mind is that for me, my first draft characters, I'm on a first date with them. So I don't really know them as well as I want to. The beginning of the first draft, my characters are not very good, but by the end of that first draft is when I can really find the voice of the characters.
I love that analogy, and I that really rings true for me. I think I probably do less character development in pre-writing as you do, because we've previously established that you do way more pre-writing than I do. But I feel the same way. I feel like as I'm writing them on the page, I'm getting to know who they are, how they would react to things, kind of what the motivation behind what they're doing would be. And I always get to Act 3, and I discover something I didn't realize about a character, which sounds so dumb because I'm writing them, but there's this magic organic process to character writing for me, where then I always have to go back and fix the character in revision, where I have to make sure that the person on the page earlier in the book matches who they've become through the writing process.
Yeah, I do a similar thing, like everything you guys are saying about like, you know, meeting the character in the first date. I'm definitely the same way. As far as pre-writing, I will have my character's arc in mind. Like, I'll know where they end, and I know like roughly where they are at the middle, and like roughly how they react to the plot points. Because character is so intertwined with story that if it's their story, then they need to be very connected to the plot points. So I'll know that sort of general idea, but actually writing the story is where I discover everything.
How much do you actually pre-write a character? Like, what do you write down, like history or characteristics, or do you kind of just jump in blind?
I don't actually write down a lot. It's usually just stuff that I keep in my head. Like, I'll have an idea of their voice. I'll have an idea of their personalities by doing some of my, I'll give them Hogwarts houses and zodiac signs and different Enneagram types, other personality types, just so I have like an idea of like who they are in general. But when I'm actually writing is just where all the specifics come out.
Yeah, I don't do quite as much as that. I feel too pinned down by even Hogwarts houses is very intimidating.
Really?
I can't even assign my characters houses when the books are like done. Like I argue with myself. Like my first book, people say, "Oh, so and so is such." I'm like, "Are they though? I don't know what house they are, and I wrote them." I digress. I have to know key traits for sure. Same. Like there's always a defining characteristic to any given character, but particularly a main character, that it's kind of like the strength and weakness. It's that trait or set of traits that will propel them through the story, create the most conflict, and dictate how they're going to react to things. I need to kind of know that. Before I start, I have to know at least enough of the character, the core of who they are, to have them react to things in an interesting way. Now, of course, I might know how I want them to react and work backwards from that, to be like, well, what kind of person would react to this inciting incident in this way? And I also need to know a core cast. So a friend or friends, and how the main character, what their dynamic with that group is. I don't have to know everything, but I need to know enough to have an idea of how that character sees the world and what they want. Actually, what they want is a huge part of, I need to know it before I start.
I do the Myers-Briggs personality quizzes for all my characters. I feel like every project I've had, I'm always simplifying my character prep with each one, and I'm doing less and less. But I do really like doing the personality test because it helps me get inside the head of that character. How would they respond to this? How would they decide on that? And that really helps in the first draft process, because I'm like, when something comes up, I feel like our initial gut is how would we react to it? And it's like, no, you have to figure out how that character would react to it, because none of my characters ever share like my same Myers-Briggs personality, which is surprising. But I know how I would react to something, have to figure out how that character would react to it.
Which brings up a really great discussion point, which is how much of ourselves do we put into characters? Because there's the whole concept of self-inserts, the pros and cons to it, and kind of how we as writers approach how much of ourselves to put in a book into characters.
I mean, I think the self-insert thing gets a bad rap, kind of.
I agree.
Because, like, I think most authors put at least bits of themselves into almost every character.
And I think we should.
Yeah. So, my earlier characters were much more, like, clear self-insert. Like, I wanted to go on this fun adventure story I'm telling, so I'm just gonna do it. And then, like, all the reactions, like Lainey was saying, it was easy. It was how I would react because the character was me. But now my self-inserts are a little bit more low-key. Like, in my current project, I have 2 main characters, and they are opposites in a lot of ways, but they share some of my opposing traits that, like, create conflict in myself.
I do that as well. Like, I very often split myself and put part of myself in a main character and part of myself in their love interest, and it's always kind of funny.
Right. Like, I'll put, like, my ambition in one character, and then, like, my cautiousness and my, like, desire to be, like, more reserved in another character, and see how those play against each other.
But do we want to kind of back up and start with kind of the essential elements of characters, like the real 101 of what you actually need to consider when you're crafting not only your main character, but side characters, love interests, and antagonists?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about that, because while the main character is arguably the most important, the supporting cast and the relationships are what make that main character. They have such a huge role. So we do need to kind of talk about the character web overall.
Yeah, and just one thing I do want to say about main characters, because I think most of us, we start with the main character. It's important to note, while character growth is kind of a 201 character topic, and we want to kind of really stick to the basics in this episode. When you're choosing your main character, it is really important to think about which character experiences the most change, because 99% of the time, that is going to be the best character through which to tell your story. So as you're kind of developing your characters, you might realize either before you start or sometimes once you've already started a book that maybe the whole story would work better from the point of view of this other character because they're actually the one experiencing a growth arc in the story.
Didn't Rochelle Mead do that with the Vampire Academy? Because I'm pretty sure it started out being a Lissa book, but then she realized that Rose was the more interesting character that needed to be the POV.
Interesting.
I didn't know that, but that's really fascinating, and I think it's a great example. And generally speaking, it can just be an interesting creative writing exercise, a story exercise, to think about the idea that you have and what if you told it from this other perspective and how that might change the story execution. It's an interesting thought experiment.
My current project actually originally started as a single point of view, one main character. And as I was developing the story, I realized that this other major character, the love interest, had such a large role and actually went through quite a lot of change themselves. And it wasn't quite their story, but they were going through enough of a change that they needed a point of view. Like, it became almost equally their story. So, yeah, now I have two main characters that it's both of their stories.
Yeah, and aside from main characters, when you're kind of developing your cast, you definitely want to, well, of course, one of your main characters is the love interest, Kat, but the love interest is very important if your book has any romance in it. And I tend to start with the main character, and then I develop their love interest second, because I mostly write romances. But then also friends. I think a lot of writers, it depends on the story, but I think it's easy to forget to give your character any friends. And maybe you're writing a loner character, but friends can be very interesting foils for a main character and a great way to kind of highlight who your character is, but also instigate change. But I will warn here, beware of giving them too many friends. While in real life it's wonderful to have a lot of friends, in fiction it can get really character soupy very fast and hard to tell everyone apart.
What is character soup, real quick, just to clarify that term for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, character soup is when you have so many characters in your book that it's difficult to remember who they all are, to tell them apart. There are characters who appear and then disappear and don't perform any real function in the story other than perhaps one scene. And of course, everyone has an outlier example, such as George R.R. Martin, of someone who has a butt ton of characters. Some genres do support larger casts more readily than others, but generally speaking, character soup can distract from readers attaching properly to the characters who are important. So
I am a repeat offender of character soup.
Me too, don't worry.
I'm always removing at least 3 or 4 characters between drafts.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, are you judging us?
I'm just, it's not a judgment. It's just like unfamiliar to me. I don't know why. I don't know why. I've never really had that much of a problem with adding too many characters. In a lot of cases, it's like I don't add enough because I'm so focused on my main characters that, I won't give them enough friends or family or any other relationships outside of the story. So I have a little bit of like the opposite problem.
Yeah, my problem, and I don't know if it's the same for you, Lainey, but it's always me striving to have it feel realistic, and the real world has a lot of people in it. And then, I go overboard where I'm like, why do I have so many background characters? No one cares about any of these people.
Yeah, one of the things with me is that I don't tend to pre-write any side characters. So I usually come up with those on the fly while I'm writing the first draft. And then there's some that just like really stick with me and I'm like, oh, I love this side character I did not prep for at all. And now I just love them.
Well, and then sometimes you have to make room in the story for them and rewrite things. I've done that before.
Yeah, because then I go back and I'm like, well, this character could honestly just serve this purpose with this character. I can combine both of them. So it's sometimes difficult to get rid of characters because, I mean, I feel like I rally behind them. I'm like, yes, I love this character. Can't wait for people to meet them. And then, like, I'll cut them in the next draft, and it's kind of devastating.
We've all murdered characters, except maybe Kat.
Oh, I've definitely murdered characters. It's just usually, like, I'll have, like, one character that... Like, I have one project where the love interest character, actually, one of the major characters, I've had to completely recast them and, like, recreate them as a new person 2 times because the person I was creating just wasn't working. So I definitely delete and combine characters as well. But probably not at the same level as you guys, because it sounds like you have to do it for every project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then lastly, something that's very important to consider when you're building your cast are antagonists, but not just antagonists, but foils. Because you really need to have contrasts to your main character to not only highlight who they are, but to challenge who they are and force them to react to things and to also show growth. So as we kind of go over all the basics that go into a character, you want to not just craft a well fleshed out main character, but a primary cast as well.
So when you guys are creating characters, what kind of basic things do you cover? You know, we talked a little bit about relationships with the other characters in the cast, and we talked a little bit about what a character wants, their goal, their motivation. So what other sort of basic character building elements do you guys incorporate?
I feel like almost all of these things I don't really know until I'm actually writing the character. I often don't think about character flaws before I start writing. I don't think about their fear to some extent. I'm mostly just focusing on their personality right before I start writing. I'll focus on the appearance of a character, a backstory to an extent, because I have one character, a main POV character in my pirate story where I really don't know her backstory. It's kind of a mystery to her, so it's a mystery to me. But I know that's something I know that's something I need to go back and really figure out. But you know, the one thing, I don't consider myself a pantser at all. However, when it comes to characters, I often pants my way through a first draft with these characters.
So is it during the revisions, during the next draft, that you figure out this stuff?
Right. During the revisions, I will go through and I'll go more in depth. I'll go back to my notebook and I'll write things down and things I find important. I do my story Bible in between my first and second drafts so that I know kind of really what I'm trying to write and who these people are. I always find the need and the motivation difficult, and that's something I'm constantly working on drafts and drafts in.
And I definitely think that's an aspect that I don't think many of us decided ahead of time. It does emerge through writing and revision. Because especially, so we talked about goal, motivation, and the want, which I think you can usually come up with ahead of time, and it's most often something pretty concrete and easy to define, and it's tied to the main conflict and stakes. But what's far more difficult to peg is the need. And I think of it as the thing that the character actually needs that they may or may not know that they need, and that the author may or may not know that they need when they start, or even at the conclusion of a first draft. But I think that it's developing the need that can add real complexity to the emotional arcs and kind of the decision making. But it's important to stress that so much of this character development stuff, you don't have to have it all figured out before you start, or even after a first draft.
And I'm someone who used to think that. Like, I would go in and I'd have to know everything about the character. And I feel like over these several projects that I've worked on in the past several years, I've lightened up that stress of needing everything to be perfect before I even start writing.
Yeah, I think for me, figuring out like want and motivation is much easier. Just also as like a writing technique, when you're writing a scene or a chapter, it's good to have something concrete that your character wants as kind of an objective. But need is much more difficult. I think, Alexa, what you were saying, like need is what makes a character complex. Like, what do they as a person like really need? That's always a little more abstract. So it's easy for me to be like, oh, this character wants to, move out of her small town and move to the city and become an actress. Like, that's what she wants. But what does she need as a person?
One essential element that plays into character that I do definitely consider ahead of time, and in many ways is one of the most important in shaping the character, and this is the one that ties into world building, is the environment. So where the story takes place is definitely something I consider ahead of time, meaning I think, where are they? Where does the majority of this action take place? And also, where did the character come from before they arrived in this environment, if they are new to it? And thus, what kind of person would this environment shape? Because we're all shaped by our environment. So if you grow up in a small town versus a city, if you grow up with money versus not having money, if you grow up in an international setting and then you move to a small town in the middle of nowhere, or if you grew up in one place and then you end up in space, whatever it is, it's going to impact who you are and then how you interact with that environment. And from that, I usually develop core traits and voice. I think it's important to talk about character voice, though it is very hard to pin down, but that's also something that sometimes you decide ahead of time, but very often you develop on the page.
Yeah, I think for me it's almost always been on the page. I might have an idea in mind of like, oh, this character is snarky, and that kind of gives like an overall tone to what their voice will be. But yeah, the specifics, the nuance all comes through on the page. It's not something that I've ever been able to like easily plan ahead of time.
I've definitely had to make some concrete decisions ahead of time. So for both of my retellings, I couldn't make them too sassy or even funny because it wouldn't fit the characters, because I was dealing with established character tropes, and let me tell you, that was hard because it pulls against my natural inclination, and I still slip some of it in. But with my new one, I knew exactly, like, this character has to be very sassy and very colorful because it suits the environment, which is a very dog-eat-dog environment.
Yeah, with my pirate book, it kind of what Kat, you said about how your two characters are kind of opposites. I had to do that too with the two best friends. They're both very different. One's more reserved and one's a lot more loud. But it's hard to kind of distinguish that voice sometimes, because sometimes I feel like they read too similar, and I'm like, it's hard to identify what is it that's like not working with certain voices.
Or like, what is it that makes them different when two characters do have so much similarities?
Right. Because
that happens. Like, and a lot of time, like, friends will be very similar, and you need to like dig a little bit deeper to figure out like what makes them different.
And that brings me to another thing that I do love doing with character development. I know this is a little extra, but I love exploring family history. Oh, yeah, I like getting into kind of psychology, because I like to think, because this is how, at least how I help to distinguish, two people are friends, and so maybe they have a similar sense of humor, but how are they raised differently is always going to be a question that I ask myself, and I create backstories, sometimes going back a few generations, of where were their parents from, and how were they raised, and how would that impact their parenting style. So was this person raised in a strict environment, or did they have helicopter parents, or absentee parents, and how does that impact that character? And it honestly helps me develop like a psychological profile of, well, that's actually kind of how I arrive at flaws and fears a lot of the time. I think about their childhoods. It's so meta. And obviously none of this makes it into the book. But I do like to think about these things, because how we're raised really strongly impacts us.
Yeah. And also those relationships, I think, it's so important to showcase character. You know, if you think about two characters, two friends who are very similar, they share a sense of humor, you can imagine like, okay, but what do they argue about? If they're friends, they're going to have something they argue about. What do they agree about?
Essentially, what is the line? Where do they draw the line? And is their line in two different places on a single topic, for example, and is that where they come to a disagreement, which you can use in your plot. I do that for love interests as well. Well, and also considering that this is very real to who we are in real life, that we fulfill different roles depending on the social situation.
Very true.
So that's also something you can play with your character. And this is all, of course, happening on the page. I think this is harder to develop ahead of time. But is your character one way with their friends and another way with their parent and yet another way with their love interest? And kind of very often the different ways that we act with different people comes from a complex combination of character traits and wants and needs and flaws. We're so sorry, people. You have to create whole human beings who are complex and real. But the thing is, if you don't do all of this work, even if it never makes it into the book, it's the iceberg theory that readers are only going to see the tip of the iceberg, but you as the author should have a pretty complex idea of everything under the surface, the world, all the characters, the backstories, the motivations, because if you don't do that, or even if you have it in your mind but it doesn't make it onto the page in any way, characters will just feel very flat. And flat characters lead to a flat reading experience.
Yeah, especially with secondary characters. Secondary characters sometimes are more difficult to craft than the main character, just because, at least with your main character, you have that voice and you have that POV that you're writing in, but you don't have that with side characters most of the time. And I think as like almost like a pro tip is that you should be thinking of all these basics for your main character just as much as you're thinking about them for your side characters as well.
Right. Yeah, it does come easier with the main character because it's their story. They're the ones interacting with the plot the most, the world the most. Their traits and their dynamics will sort of come to the surface a little bit easier than with secondary characters. So sometimes you do have to kind of imagine, like, okay, if this secondary character was the main character, like, how would they play out against the world, against the story?
Especially when you think of some of your favorite authors who do side characters very well, it's because they really think about all these other things. Technically, every secondary character should also have a want and a need and a motivation.
Right.
Well, and it's the cliche, but it's a very true one, which is every character is the hero of their own story.
Right.
And you have to think of it that way, or at least for the majority of your characters. Like, I don't think it really matters, like, Fred, who shows up on one page. You don't have to do an elaborate backstory, but definitely any character who shares significant screen time with your main character, you can't write realistic reactions of those characters to your main character unless you know a lot about them and how they view the world and what motivations and wants they're bringing into any given interaction.
Right. I would say, at least for the main character, their love interest or the secondary most important character, and the antagonist or the foil if it's not exactly an antagonist. But like, if you can really nail down those three characters, at least like 2 or 3 players in your book, then that's like the main thing that you want to nail down. Like, the other secondary characters who might not show up a lot, you don't need to get super in depth with them. But at least your 3 major characters.
And also, I'd say when you're developing those characters, particularly your antagonist, you see the main character as the hero of the story, of course, and they see themselves that way. But I like to think about how those other characters, how do they view the characters? How does their perspective and experience inform their view? And specifically, what thing that the main character holds to be absolutely true, either about themselves or about the world, would that other character disagree with? And this includes the character's own flaws. I've been able to actually call out my main characters for doing shitty things, essentially, like by having other characters point out the flip side of whatever I have the main character doing. So I have the main character doing organic things to their character, but then I use a foil character to point out like, hey, you're being a selfish asshole, or whatever it is,
right,
so that the readers don't call me out on it. I'm kidding. But I think we all have something about ourselves that we view as an absolute or a truth or a strength, and from someone else's perspective, it can be the opposite.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's interesting. That's what people like reading about. They like seeing that dynamic, that juxtaposition of two ideas. I think one thing that I pay special attention to when developing secondary characters is their relationships that don't involve the protagonists at all. Because a lot of the time, you know, you might develop your protagonist and like their relationship with like the three friends in their friend group, but you don't spend enough time developing how those friends who aren't your protagonist interact together. And that doing something like that can just make them feel a lot more real, because then they feel like they have their own relationships that are separate from the protagonist, separate from the story, and it breathes life into some of these secondary characters that might not be around a lot, but getting glimpses into their relationships that aren't central to the story can really add another layer to them.
Yeah, what you really have to be careful of is secondary characters who feel like plot devices. And even if they are a plot device, you need to hide it.
Right.
Because people will call you out on that.
And some writers are worse at it than others. Like, there are just certain books where you read it and you're like, I'm pretty sure this character only exists as a plot device. And it's just, it's such a letdown.
Yeah, it happens a lot with parent characters and mentor characters.
Yes.
You know, they serve just to like scold their child and ground them and like throw some barriers in the way of them saving the world.
The friend characters fall into this easily as well. The
Right.
sidekick character who just exists to make the right suggestion at the right time, or
Right.
have their life in danger at the right time. And generally speaking, I think that's why there's such value in doing all of this deep character work for as many characters as you can, because the projects, the stories and the books and so on that people love the most, I find, have very strong, dynamic, layered casts. Like, every character has punch and kind of sings on the page, and certain writers are just really good at that, and I find that they are most likely to have fandoms.
Right.
But I also think it's worth pointing out, just no matter what you do and how much work you do and how great your characters are, someone's not gonna like them, and that's okay.
And I think that's actually the biggest con of something we talked about briefly earlier, self-insert characters. If you feel like you are your character and that character is so close and so precious to you, someone having a negative opinion about it is going to hit you much harder. It's going to be much closer to home because you feel so close to that character. They are you.
Yeah, and even, honestly, giving characters pieces of yourself, the same thing can happen.
Yeah.
Because if the thing someone doesn't like about any given character is that piece of yourself, it can hurt. But also, it's kind of, again, you just have to be like, oh, well, people aren't a monolith. We all don't believe the same things. Because, for example, I've put real pieces of my anxiety into my books and characters, which I think a lot of us writers do, because so many of us are anxious. But then there are other readers who that's not what pings with them at all, and so they don't like the way I did it. I'm like, well, it's authentic to me, so oh well.
You know, maybe that's another thing that we can talk a little bit about, putting yourself into characters and the sort of monolith experience, about how like no character is a monolith. Like, if you put in parts of your anxiety or any other aspect of you, you know, that is still valid and that is still an accurate representation, but it's not going to ring true to absolutely everyone.
Yeah, and I think also not just with self-insert, but wish fulfillment. I also kind of sometimes put things that I wish that I could do or that I did in those in certain characters that I write. Like, I have one character, she's pursuing like a history education, and if I didn't get an English degree, I would have gone for history. So it's just kind of like, well, this was what I could have had. Indiana Jones.
Right.
I have them do like witty comebacks that I wish I could have said in my life. That's always really fun.
Yeah, that's one thing for me is humor. And if someone was like, oh, I don't like, this character's sense of humor, I don't think they're funny, then to me, I would be like, oh, so you don't think I'm funny? Because, like, that's my sense of humor. Like, I wrote that. So we've talked about these basics of character creation a little bit, and we have talked about how we don't often know a lot of this ahead of time. Can you guys answer all these questions for, like, your current projects now in revision stage? Like, do you know your character's fear, flaw, voice, appearance? Like, can you just drop it off the top of your head now? Or would you still have to think about, like, what is their fear?
I could probably do everything but the want versus the need.
Interesting.
Because I feel like want versus need goes into character arc, and I feel like I'm always refining the character arc to really, like, nail down the whole emotional plot journey of a character, and want versus need feeds into that.
Right.
For my current project, yeah, I do feel that I know my main character well enough to answer all of these, and that's pretty common for me after a first draft with my main character. I tend to have a really good sense of them. It just takes one draft, even though I might have to refine them. But I couldn't answer all of those questions for my love interest or my primary foil or antagonist. It takes a few more drafts for me on them. I mean, without fail, every single book I've written, the primary foil antagonist, not necessarily the bad guy, but the person who gets in the way of my main character the most, who's always a female friend, I always have to fix them, essentially, because they always require way more nuance, particularly because I like to flesh out my worlds in YA with complex female characters, but unless you know them very well, they come off super one note if you're not careful. I think we all get to know our main characters more than anyone else, and it's actually all the other characters who tend to require the most work. Which actually brings me to a very interesting question/discussion topic that I think does come up for a lot of us in revision, which is, have you ever had to recast one of your characters / drastically changed who they are and kind of what purpose they served?
Oh, have I? Yeah, this is the Curse of Storyteller. Storyteller is a project that I drafted in NaNoWriMo 2012. I've been working on it on and off for the last 7 years. And over the last 7 years, some of these on and off workings on have been recasting the love interest character, who I've had to completely change twice. Because the first time, who they were as a person, like their relation, it wasn't their personality, it was like their relationships with the other characters and just a lot of other nuanced things that had to do with like the group dynamics. And I was like, this person isn't working. So like they were supposed to play the role of love interest, but them as a character in the story, they just needed to be completely different. So I've recasted this character twice now. And when I jump back into Storyteller, it'll be my third attempt at this character. Though I think I have worked it out, and I think I finally landed on who they are finally going to be.
I've also had to recast and change characters before, but I think one of the most uplifting versions of this is that I used to have a character that was kind of like the foil of the story, and he didn't really have that much of a presence, I guess. He was just kind of like a side character, but with each draft I wrote, he became more and more important. And to the point where I pretty much made him the love interest. I made him like the secondary main character. So that was like fun because I'm like, oh, this character was secretly wanting to come out this entire time. And it's just taken several drafts to do so. But it was more rewarding for me that way.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience on my first two published ones, the retellings. My recasting was actually kind of reworking the character tropes from the originals, because both of them had a guy in the third act who was a complete douchebag to the main character and existed as an obstacle to her and basically like a misogynist vehicle. And I essentially recast both of those characters. I decided instead to make them more nuanced and layered male characters who actually respected my female character's agency and were obstacles in totally different ways. So that was kind of my recasting, and it's mostly just because both of those men ended up being my favorite characters. Maybe I have a problem. It's in challenging tropes, character tropes, where I have changed and essentially recast and reworked characters. And same thing, and I have a habit of recasting antagonists, because I'll start with one in mind, and then I'll fall in love with them. I'll just decide that they're such a wooby that I understand their backstory so intricately that I can't possibly have them be the main sociopath. So I have a terrible habit of doing that, but I think that hopefully then adds more layers and makes things more complex, because then I end up with multiple antagonists. Just some of them are more understandable and layered than other ones.
I think what you mentioned about kind of like de-troping characters is a really important point, because a lot of the time, like when we're doing a side character, we might just reach for a stereotype, reach for like, oh, sassy best friend, and like purposely deconstructing that trope and like adding the nuance right into the character is a great way to go about like creating complex characters that have nuance that aren't just walking tropes.
Everyone has a secret, and I like to give them secrets to make them more complex, because you basically don't want any human being character to be one note, because no one is one thing. No one is completely awful or completely perfect, completely kind, etc. So speaking of kind of subverting tropes and archetypes, I think something many of us struggle with is making our characters feel unique, like they stand apart within genre and tropes, and kind of walking the line of they fit a familiar trope or archetype, but they also feel like a memorable, unique character. Do you guys have any tips for how to do this?
Well, I really like different personality tests, and, you know, like using the Zodiac and the Enneagram to kind of pick and choose different traits. I also just love giving my characters contradictions within themselves. Like if their main trait is they are very ambitious, well, they also have a lazy streak where, you know, like they have a lot of ambition, but they also just love chilling and watching Netflix. Something to create a sort of like inner conflict within themselves, because I think that's very interesting, and you can choose from a whole like list of contradicting qualities to put in them and to like explore that.
Yeah, same. I know I said this earlier, but I love using the Myers-Briggs personality test, because it really helps me craft a certain kind of character. And then I can go off and do my own thing once I start writing it.
So something that helps me, and I should offer the disclaimer that you can't always create some magical, unique snowflake character. It's really hard to come up with characters who are kind of seminal and really pop. And if you're lucky as a writer, you come up with one or two of those in your career. So I don't want anyone to feel the pressure of like every single character in my story has to break the mold. There are molds for a reason. People actually like familiar archetypes and tropes. And I do like to think about, and we haven't covered this yet, I do think about hobbies and talents when I'm developing characters. And this can be a way to just give the book and the character specificity that helps it feel sticky, or at least different from similar books in the genre or category. And it could be whatever fits your world, but think about how, for example, in the Hunger Games, Katniss was a really skilled archer. That was her big skill. And that, in combination with what was actually a pretty unique personality type to lead a YA novel, is what makes her really stand out for so many people. It was giving some specificity to her character, but also playing against character tropes. That's one memorable character. I do like the specificity of what is the thing they love or the thing that they're good at that you can research and kind of pepper in the book and layer into your book.
Yeah, because it's also not just about, you know, giving them some random quality. A lot of the time you want to tie that into the story. You know, it's not that every single hobby has to be like a vital key plot point, but you do want it to mean something. Like, you're not just making empty decisions and just like throwing things out there just to, you know, give your character a hobby. Oh, they like to cook. That doesn't mean anything, but they like to cook. I think it's important to realize that any of these character crafting choices you make, none of them are made in a vacuum. Like, it's always going to play against other things. You know, one character dynamic might come into play with the plot point in an unexpected way.
So now it is a time to move into our Patreon question of the week. And this one comes from Jessica, who asks, I've been given an R&R from an agent. I think she makes some good points on things I could improve. I have many other queries out, though. Is there a best way to handle that? I'd love these agents to see my improved version once I finish my R&R. Do I resend it? Do I pull back my queries that are already out? Do I just query different agents?
It depends.
Well, first of all, I want to say congrats on getting an R&R. Like, that's a great step. You're in the right direction.
And for listeners who don't know, that stands for revise and resubmit, which means an agent liked your book enough to give you notes on the things that weren't working for them, and they're basically saying, if you revise based on my notes, I would love to take another look at your manuscript.
Have you guys ever been given an R&R when you queried?
I have, and so this is the way that I managed it. And I should say that R&Rs are kind of complex, and it really depends on your R&R situation, because sometimes, and it doesn't sound like that's the case here, but sometimes when you get an R&R from an agent, it's actually an exclusive R&R, and it's worth asking if that's the case, meaning sometimes an agent is so interested in your manuscript but really needs to see how you handle a revision, but they've taken the time to give you specific notes that meet their vision and that you could work together on. Like, they feel they could sell this iteration of your novel if you take their notes, and they don't want you to make this amazing manuscript and send it to someone else before them instead of them and get an agent based off of kind of their notes. So usually an exclusive R&R means you agree not to send the updated version of the manuscript to any other agents until the agent who gave you the exclusive has the opportunity to review. And usually you shouldn't give them more than a month or so to look at that. So it's not forever. They can't squat on your revised version forever, but just sometimes that is the case. However, in many cases it's not, especially if the notes are broad. So in this case, it's up to you. If you strongly feel that this revision is going to be a game changer for your novel, like this agent's notes have cracked it wide open, and you know with complete confidence that the new book is going to be better, reach out to everyone who has your manuscript and you basically withdraw whatever they have. You say, checking in, I don't know if you've had time to read yet, but in the event that you haven't, I wanted to let you know I've received an R&R for another agent. I plan on executing it, and I would love to send you the new and improved manuscript when it is complete. Most agents will go, thank you for letting me know. I'd love to look at it when you're done. So you basically pause all of your queries. You usually only do this if they've actually requested your material. A cold query, just wait and see if they respond. If they respond to it to request, that's when you tell them, thank you so much for your request. I'm actually in the middle of an R&R. So it's not a big deal. I definitely would not query any new agents until the revised version is ready. The version of the book that you are confident is going to be better. That said, if the revision, this includes if the revision is exclusive, you can also just kind of let the other version of the manuscript stay out with agents and see what happens there. That is what I did. I ended up signing with the agent I did the revision for, but her changes weren't so astronomical that I felt the need to withdraw my manuscript from other agents.
And also considering how well this agent's views match with yours. Like, does her version really resonate with you? And also, how do you feel about this agent in general? Like, if this agent had offered, would you love that? Like, do you want to work with this agent? All right, that is our episode. Again, thank you to all of our patrons for your support. You can check out our page at patreon.com/noveltyshow, where our patrons can suggest topics, ask questions, participate in our Discord, and vote in polls.
We also broadcast live shows on YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel, Novelty Show. Follow us on Twitter at Novelty Show for updates and announcements.
If you like us, please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. And we'd really appreciate it if you can rate and review us on iTunes and Google Play. Doing so helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other listeners find us. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.